Hi, welcome to the seminar on sulfur. This is going to sizzle. I'm Rob Saik, and I'm your host. I'm the CEO and founder of AGvisorPRO. We've got three great guests, and we're going to cover about 45 minutes of talk about sulfur, and particularly elemental sulfur, and in particular bentonite sulfur. We got three great guests for you. Daryl Schuster, who about 100 years ago graduated from State, is the CEO and founder of Keg River Sulfur. Is out of Sherwood Park, Alberta, and they're celebrating their 25th anniversary of producing sulfur. So that's really, really cool. Dr. Terry Tindall and I go way back. He's from Boise, Idaho, and he was the corporate agronomist for Simplot, involved in retail, wholesale, and agronomics, high-value crops, working in irrigation, all sorts of things. Elston Solberg and I go back a zillion years, and Elston has been working in the sulfur nutrition area for over 43 years. And he's been talking about sulfur all over the planet Earth, and just got back from India. And, some of the greatest resistance on sulfur is actually in North America. And we're going to talk about that. So the first question, Daryl, I'm going to put to you is, why are you hosting this event, and why sulfur?
Well, I'm glad that we're starting this, to get some, more discussion going on, the use of sulfur, and more in a general sense, just to, bring more awareness to it. We have lots of competitors that make very good products, and so if we can just roundabout bring some more awareness and ask some critical questions about its use, different applications, how to make it more acceptable for our customers. Ultimately I just want to bring more awareness. So yeah.
Cool. So thanks for hosting this webinar, and it's awesome that we have the guests on that we do. Terry Tindall. Terry, where are you right now, and why sulfur, Terry? Why are you interested in sulfur? Why have you devoted so much of your career to studying this particular nutrient?
I appreciate that. Yes, I'm located in Boise, Idaho, but I've with Simplot, and I've traveled the world similar to most everybody, working on plant nutrition, nutrient use efficiency. Sulfur is a key component of nutrition. They consider it the fourth major nutrient. Nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. Sulfur is essential on developing proteins, food quality, long-term reliability, sustainability. It's all about sulfur, Rob, and in combination with other nutrients. So I'm excited to be a part of this webinar.
Elston, you go back a long way talking about sulfur, all the way back to a guy named Dr. Nyberg at the University of Alberta. Talk to me a little bit about why sulfur is still engaging for you after these decades of talking about the SSS.
Well, it's a long story, but I mean, over the course of my experience, 43 plus years working with elemental sulfur, I actually was dreaming last night that elemental sulfur is in my veins. And, the reality is, globally, we grossly underestimate the importance of sulfur in our production systems. And in the course of my life and my career, we've doubled and tripled the yields that the average farmer grows, especially in North America and Europe and otherwise. And, that puts a tremendous amount of pressure on the system. And then overlaying that is all the environmental regulations that have essentially cleaned sulfur out of the atmosphere, either as wet deposition or dry deposition. So, the issues relating to sulfur just amplify. And, when it comes to some of the tools that we should be using to identify sulfur deficiency and otherwise is the tissue test. And the most important ratio in a tissue test, just like a blood sample, is the N/S ratio. And once you start nailing down the N/S ratio, then life, the environment, and everything else gets a lot of happier place.
What do you mean by N/S ratio, Elston? What is it that you're looking at there in terms of the magic sauce or the relative relationship between nitrogen and sulfur?
Well, every crop group that we grow has a specific nitrogen to sulfur ratio that it desires, right? And so as agronomists and the specialists in the field and as farmers, we need to start thinking like plants. So if I'm a canola plant or a mustard plant, how much sulfur do I need relative to the nitrogen that I require? And if I'm a pulse or a legume for the Americans, what is the ratio, and cereals and corn and everything else? And it turns out 6-to-1 for canola and mustard and those kind of crops, brassicas, 8-to-1 for pulses or legumes, and 10-to-1 for the rest of them is a good resting place. So
sure.
Yeah.
So 6-to-1.
Rob,
Yeah.
Rob, let me interject something as well.
Perfect.
In the Pacific Northwest under irrigated crops, we're dealing with high value crops. Potatoes, of course, is the #1 vegetable in the world. We can't discount that being out of Idaho. But onions, onions are a large concern of irrigated crops. Onions are very interesting because those onions that are stored have high levels of pyruvic acid in them. Pyruvic acid is essential to that long-term storage, but it depends on available sulfur. And so most of our onion fields, potato fields, they've got levels of sulfur, elemental sulfur, that are going on an annual basis, somewhere between 200, 300 per acres, or I'm sorry, 200 to 300 pounds of sulfur per acre. And then in combination with sulfate sources as well, that we could pursue that. So Elston is exactly right. You've got to look at the individual crops. You've got to look at nutrient uptake and balance those things out. But again, sulfur becomes so essential in raising these high value crops in the Pacific Northwest.
So I'm going to just ask you a follow-on question here, because we're talking about elemental sulfur. We're going to get to Daryl in a second about the products that Keg River produces. But one of the things that elemental sulfur does is a slower release over time, and that actually resists leaching, and especially important in irrigated situations. Can you comment on that, Terry?
Yeah, absolutely. So sulfur is not water soluble, and so it remains in place. What's interesting though is it's once the sulfur is oxidized, it forms sulfate, and the sulfate is what is the nutrients is taken up by the plant. Sulfate, Rob, is mobile in a similar manner as nitrate, and so the combination of elemental sulfur in combination with sulfate allows an environment of where you have immediately available sulfur or sulfate, as well as long-term residual sulfur that breaks down or oxidizes over a period of time.
Perfect. So this leads very nicely back to Daryl. Daryl, Keg River Sulfur produces a couple different types of sulfur. Can you comment a little bit about the analysis that you produce, and then maybe start to break into the whole idea of bentonite, and then I'll kind of talk a little bit about how we're going to convert that elemental sulfur into what Terry just talked about, which is sulfate.
Yeah. So specifically, 25 years ago, actually, it goes back further than that. Many years ago, I ran some products, out of Calgary, that we made some stuff specifically for the Invermay research station in New Zealand. So they asked us to make some higher bentonite contents. And part of the, obviously some of it was because of degradability, but some of it was also because it makes the product safer. And so we ended up with making several different products, which they tested. And they said, obviously, the higher bentonite content, it makes the degradability much better.
Now, Daryl, just comment a little bit on the word bentonite and what does it mean? How does it play a role?
Well, the bentonite is so bentonite clay is actually it's basically a powdered clay. It has to be something that you can suspend in the sulfur. It's a swelling clay. So for us to take a look at the different clays that are available, it makes a huge difference, you know, what kind of clay you have and how it's processed. Most of the, you know, we actually blend two clays from two smaller producers so that we can get the quality control that we want. But it also has to do with moisture content. So if you completely dry a clay out, it just becomes ash. So if you're, but for operational purposes, some operators have said, well, they would like to have less moisture content because that turns, you know, you're putting it into a molten liquid that is around 280 degrees Fahrenheit. So it creates steam and condensate and mud and that kind of thing. And also it's acidic in that atmosphere. So it actually, you know, is quite acidic. So what you have to do is get rid of most of the bound moisture. So all you have left is, so that'll eliminate some of your operational problems. And then but you got to leave 100% of, I'm sorry, get rid of some of the free moisture, and keep the bound moisture. Because if you dry the clay right out to 2% or 1.5%, it actually won't swell at all. So if you made a product, essentially it won't be degradable. Another thing, Rob, we experimented with this obviously because, you know, at the bare minimum, you need 10% of the best clay, bare minimum.
Right. Yep.
If you went down to 7% clay, it isn't like it only drops it down by 30%. It drops it to 0. You have 0 degradability. That has absolutely no value to the customer at all. And then if you're taking, say, a drilling mud clay, a drilling mud clay where they're trying to make a drilling mud clays you know, they're basically categorized on yields, barrels of yield per ton of clay. And so the moisture content isn't really important to them. What they end up with is an average moisture content. But in drying the clay to a certain point, they end up, you know, if they don't dry it, you know, twice, like dry it down to a certain moisture content once and then the next time to another point, if they just crank up the heat, you're going to burn some of that clay to ash. And the clay particles are made up of different platelets, you know, like this. And so those plates, those will collapse. So they have no, they're not going to absorb water at all.
So if I can, you know, characterize what you're trying to get accomplished here, you're saying that in Keg River Sulfur, you are utilizing very high quality clays. You don't over dry them, and then therefore you're keeping as much of the swelling properties, we'll get into that in just a second, as possible. Now, what are the analysis of the sulfurs that you're producing that farmers and retailers would use?
Right. So 25 years ago, we thought that, you know, an 85% sulfur with 15% clay was really ideal because you know, you have a higher inert solids. So, and sulfur products, you know, tend to have a static discharge. So airborne, you know, dust would, you know, potentially be ignited by itself from static discharge. But you reduce that, it's called bulk resistivity. You can reduce that a lot just by adding more inert solids. So an 85% sulfur with 15% clay is significantly safer, but it also adds to the hardness of the particle. So the crushing strength of a 90% as opposed to an 85, the crushing strength of the 85 is significantly harder. It resists dust from attrition, from handling. It resists chipping and fracturing. Obviously, a lot of that is also, you know, how you process and how well you process it.
So what does that mean then? I mean, these are fairly technical terms. I'm just trying to boil this down. So is it an 85 or a 90 that you're bringing to the market, Daryl, and you base that on several characteristics that you're starting to elude?
Yeah. So the 85 is more degradable for sure. It has a longer shelf life, if you know what I mean. Sulfur crystals tend to get stronger over time, you know, so after the sulfur is cooled, you know, in the first couple of days, it's rather plastic, but then it gets harder and harder over time. 85% has a much higher degradability. So the amount of particulate that you're going to have that's, you know, much finer is going to be significant. It's like 50% more clay. It makes up about half of our total business. There's an awful lot of business that's 90%, and that's good product. But, you know, the 85 isn't significantly different in cost, you know, to produce. and yet its value, if you're looking for degradability, its value as,
Okay.
degradability is quite a bit higher.
Okay, so now we're going to get into this thing. So if I can summarize in layman's terms, Keg River takes elemental sulfur in, kind of 99.9% elemental sulfur. You turn it into a molten state. You mix in bentonite clay at either 10 to 15%, and that turns into a pastille that is a fertilizer. It's shaped like a lentil or a cookie, and farmers can utilize it. Elston, back to you now. And why is the clay important? And I'll preface at the end, but from a scientific standpoint, what's going on and why do we need to add clay? Why can't we use just pure elemental 99.99% sulfur? Because some farmers have been asking me, well, I'll just put on straight elemental sulfur. Why is the addition of bentonite so critical to the equation?
So at the end of the day, it's pretty straightforward and pretty simple, is that the bentonitic clay that's being utilized with the Keg River products basically swells 15 times its original size. So when you're mixing the bentonitic clay with the molten elemental sulfur, what happens is the clay gets wet either from the soil moisture, from rain, or whatever else moisture. It swells up to 15x, and it fractures the molten sulfur into a wide range of particle sizes. And so the particle sizes is the key to the whole thing, plus some dispersion. And basically, the smaller the particle, the greater the surface area. The greater the surface area, the more microbial contact. The more microbial contact, the greater, the faster the conversion of elemental or nutrimental sulfur to sulfate sulfur. And so one of the pieces of the puzzle within the Keg River products is that expansion creates a wide range of particle sizes, which means over the course of a period of time, you have slow biological release of sulfate sulfur to the crop. It's kind of like Chinese torture, right? Drip, 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 instead of, the ammonium sulfate forced.
So the ammonium sulfate will tend to flush sulfate,
Right.
whereas elemental sulfur, once the bentonite fractures, it turns it into a variety of particle sizes, and these are referred to as micron sizes. And what happens to the microns? How do they get converted from elemental, Elston, into sulfate?
Well, there's organisms in the soil that are, designed to oxidize or convert elemental sulfur to sulfate sulfur, and everybody thinks there's only one. It's thiobacillus thiooxidans, but the reality is there's hundreds of them, maybe thousands. And thiobacillus thiooxidans is like the Superman of oxidizers. But what we learned way back in the early 80s is that it's a wide range of organisms. And if you've ever had elemental sulfur applied to your field, the next application is going to convert more quickly because you've essentially inoculated your field with organisms that their specialty is breaking down elemental sulfur.
All right. So this is kind of interesting. So you have sulfur with bentonite clay. It's fractured due to moisture absorption. It gets into a wide variety of particles, and then these bugs, these thiobacillus thiooxidans, basically eat the elemental sulfur and poop out sulfuric acid that converts in. Talk about red ring. But anyways, it poops out sulfuric acid that converts into sulfate. Have I got that right, Elston?
Yeah, pretty much. The only thing you got wrong is that there's way more species of soil organisms that do that than the big guy, right? So yeah, but at the end of the day, it's exactly what you said.
So Terry, given the fact that you, like Elston said, you don't have this flush of sulfate, but rather you have this drip, 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 drip of sulfur releasing over time, why is that an advantage to farmers? Why is it an advantage to crops?
Well, the crops, yeah, that's a good question. And so in simplistic terms, the crop is looking at some nutrients immediately. And so there's generally a combination of, for example, we create a starter fertilizer combination with the liquid sulfur, ammonium thiosulfate, and it's right at the root zone or above the root zone for a place for onions, potatoes, sugar beets. But in the combination, in the background of all this, there's the elemental sulfur. The bentonite clay allows these small particles to be broken down more easily. As the temperatures warm up, then the thiobacillus and other microorganisms will break down or oxidize the sulfur into these forms. And so by allowing, immediate applications of sulfur to be placed at the very beginning, you get a nice root growth, benefits to the developing plant immediately. And then I guess you'd say the long-term, the drip, drip, drip over a period of time to break down the elemental sulfur into a usable form that could still maintain benefits throughout the longevity of the crop. And in our area, Rob, in Boise, we have 220 to 230 frost-free days or growing days. Wouldn't that be something?
It's snowing today in Alberta, by the way. So
I thought I would just rub that in for sure. But modern fertilizers in combination with the bentonite technology makes a really nice application for sulfur. You still have to have the basic principles. You need a small particle. You need thiobacillus or other organisms to break it down. You need warmer temperatures to make those conversions. And then the nutrient availability, becomes long lasting. One additional point, if I can make this, is that our growers, potato growers on our own Simplot farms, are making applications of elemental sulfur on a yearly basis.
Yeah.
They're either making it in the fall or in the spring. And so that annual application, allows this almost a steady state of available sulfur to be available to these high value crops.
So Elston, back to you on this, and you said something earlier about this drip, drip, drip idea, and you also mentioned something about previous applications of elemental sulfur mean that subsequent applications actually get oxidized at a more rapid state. You want to expand on that?
That's really simple, Rob. So back when I was doing my master's degree, we had plots all over the place, and we sampled the areas that had received a small amount of elemental sulfur, like 10 pounds per acre kind of stuff. And then the adjacent check treatments that received none in the history of the experiments, and some of them lasted for a long time. And then we went to remote soils, and in every case, the soils that had received a small amount of elemental sulfur previously converted to the next batch much more rapidly. And the crazy part was the adjacent check treatments that had never received elemental sulfur converted more quickly than the remote soil, which means just the equipment going across the plots and stuff like that transferred the microbes. And so then we dug into some of the species and all of that sort of stuff, and we learned that there's a whole bunch of bugs that convert elemental sulfur to sulfate sulfur. So that at the end of the day, if you've ever used an elemental sulfur product in your program, whether we got a big audience here, but in Western Canada it's S15 and MES and the bentonitic sulfurs and the biosols and all of the rest of them, thiobacillus even will initiate that because it's an intermediary breakdown product from elemental to sulfate. You've got bugs there that are just like they're sitting there waiting and saying, get me some more sulfur, get me some more elemental sulfur so I can get busy again, right? And yeah, that's a long-winded answer, but the bugs.
Yeah, there's from a farmer standpoint, there's a big story here, because if you can take sulfur out of the planter, out of the air drill, you can reduce the volume that you're putting down in the springtime. And that is significant for logistics, right? Elston?
We've done this, Rob. We know that you can increase the number of acres seeded by taking sulfur out of the tank by about 20%. And more than that, the most insidiously painful product that you can ever put in a tank is the most commonly used product, right? And because it cakes, it dusts, it does all kinds of nasty stuff. So you can get it out of the tank. You increase the acres per fill by 20%. In Western Canada, where we got 110 days versus Terry's 230 or whatever he said, bugger you. That's a big deal. That's a big deal.
Daryl, over the course of 25 years, Keg River's had a pretty good history. Your observation of the changing attitude towards farmers, or maybe the agronomic community, understanding or maybe not understanding the importance and the role that elemental sulfur can play. What's your opinion of your impression of the market over the course of the 25 years?
Well, say for instance, like we've seen a significant growth, from our first year, and and maybe we peaked about 3 years ago, where now we're reaching a point of where I think there is a lot more awareness, but it's not, it hasn't grown as much as I'd have thought. But in that 25 years, we've we would be maybe 7 times the volume that we would have been in the first 2 or 3 years. So definitely there's more awareness. But 25 years ago, they were still selling ammonium sulfate just for the nitrogen value. So
Right.
that was hard to compete with. So a lot of what we were selling was ending up more for soil amendment. So it was meant to just lower the pH. And so, Pacific Northwest was a big part of it, of our first few years. But there's no, there used to be a lot of waste ammonium sulfate around, and that isn't, how it's done anymore. So, we've seen a lot of growth, and we're not the only ones. There's been a lot of growth, but
yeah,
I would say that some of that has to do with also taking, so it's, the refineries aren't, producing fuels that have sulfur in them anymore. There's quite a few things.
Sure. I think I'm going to turn back to Terry a little bit. You just touched on something here, Daryl, that I want Terry to expand on, and that is soil amendment. Because when we're talking about elemental sulfur, we're talking about the conversion of elemental sulfur into sulfuric acid into sulfate. There's an acidulation process there that's very important. And Elston, just this week, we were talking about a situation to utilize elemental sulfur. I'll come back to you on that, to flocculate or to try to deal with the sodic situation. Terry, when it comes to high pH soils and the role that elemental sulfur can play, you comment on that from a soil amelioration or amendment standpoint?
Yeah. Yes. In fact, Rob, it's a great question, a great part of the conversation. So far, we've talked about nutrition, but a part of the value of elemental sulfur is on as a soil amendment, specifically in an attempt to lower high pHs down to a pH where phosphorus is more available, zinc is more available at lower pHs. Elemental sulfur is applied to the soil. It's broken down. It's releasing hydrogen ions. Those free hydrogen ions then tend to impact soil pH. A bit of the challenge is when you have an excessive amount of free lime, calcium carbonate equivalents, free lime. You tend to need large amounts of elemental sulfur to reduce to the overall pH. But let's think about this in a potato field, because potatoes, you're applying the elemental sulfur or any of the nutrients, and you're forming hills, or you're creating an environment where you're trying to impact changes in a relatively smaller area. And you can have some effective changes, in some of those soils, albeit it's very difficult to see much of a change on soils with high amounts of free lime. But many areas of the Pacific Northwest, the amount of free lime is 1% or less than 1%. And you can see changes occurring on elemental sulfur. For example, we try to lower the pH from 7.5 to a pH of around 7. On sandy, coarse textured soils, the rate would be about 300 pounds per acre of elemental sulfur, where the percent free lime is relatively small.
So Terry,
Rob-
this is also kind of interesting because you take spread out 300 pounds of elemental sulfur like a Keg River 85 on the soil surface, and then in embedded crops like potatoes where you're hilling, you're concentrating that elemental sulfur into a zone. And we know that a lot of crops like to ideally work in pH, grow in a pH of environment about 6.6. And so even though you're not changing the soil, maybe in the zones you might be, correct?
It might be, yes. You're trying to influence that zone. It's not like a soil-less media because you've got the soil components that are there, and you're combining, different extremely soluble sulfate levels with the elemental sulfur, and so you're impacting that microenvironment that you're working with.
Elston, when we get thinking about elemental sulfur, there's several advantages. Again, one would be decreased volume through the drill because you're not putting ammonium sulfate through the drill. Number two is you've got release throughout the growing season, and I would argue into several growing seasons. But this whole idea of soil amendment and amelioration, can you comment on that, especially when it comes to thinking about sodic soils?
Well, before I get to sodic soils, I'm going to just follow up on what Terry was saying, because I've done this with, several potato guys in particular, and that is when you get a whole bunch of elemental sulfur on a field, and then during the hilling process or whatever, you're essentially concentrating that sulfur in a much smaller area. And so what that does relative to the potato plant is it concentrates some biogenic acidulation. So that's a biological conversion that creates some drip, drip, drip acidulation. And what that does is it helps fight diseases, and it helps fight pests, and it helps to release nutrients. And, Rob, you've known me long enough to know that I have said for years that we need to start thinking like plants. And
Right.
we need to start thinking like plant roots. And that's really important because in that zone of acidulation, biogenic drip, drip, drip acidulation, there's release of all kinds of other things. On the sodic side of the equation.
Elston, just before you go there, and when we're talking about soil, the health of the soil, and this whole mantra or this new word called regenerative agriculture, which I think comes back down to good agronomy, this philosophy of utilizing elemental sulfur to make healthier soils is a good idea.
Anything that you can do that will regenerate or cause the soil to be more biologically active is a regenerative agricultural thing. It's just that simple. And so elemental sulfurs are a great tool to help do that, and it extends to the root system and to the plant health and to the N-to-S ratios and everything else within the crop. And then on the flip side, when you're looking at specific scenarios where maybe you have a sodic soil situation and you're trying to figure out.
What does that mean, Elston? I use the word sodic. You know what it means, but maybe you need a little definition there.
Yeah, well, it's a good question because a lot of people get confused out there because there's in that realm of soil management, there's three factors: sodicity, salinity, and then the combination of salinity and sodicity. And they all require slightly different management if you're trying to fix them. But at the end of the day, if you've got too much sodium in the system, So anything that's over 2% base saturation of sodium is not a good place to be. In dry land and irrigation, 1% is not a good place to be, because sodium's a soil structure bitch. And what it creates is big lumps and sealing and everything else. And so elemental sulfur in the right management circumstances and the right conditions can help co-create gypsum in the soil, which knocks sodium off the exchange complex. And I'm getting too complex, but it knocks sodium off the exchange complex. And then if you can provide a route for that sodium to get out of the system, Bob's your uncle, and things start to improve.
So we can use elemental sulfur in a sodic situation, which has a high degree of sodium, and we can use that elemental sulfur to create acidulation to flocculate the soil. I think that's the right word, Elston.
Yeah, you got to be careful how you pronounce that word. But yeah, no, and then I mean, it's not the only solution, because you need some drainage or some avenue for that sodium to leave the system, right? And so yeah, it's more complicated than just putting on a shit whack of elemental sulfur, but it is
right. It's an agronomic type of program. There are several pieces to the puzzle. Daryl, back over to you. And what I'm going to ask you now is from a standpoint of maybe the farmer, but maybe we got a lot of retailers that are involved on this webinar. Tell me a little bit about, why would a retailer consider using Keg River and in his operation, and the benefit that would go back to the farm on this. And I think, your comments around quality are self-evident, but, from a standpoint of retailer reaching out to you, talk to me a little bit about the conversations that you would have with a retailer.
Yeah, well, with a retailer, I think, overall, we have other competitors out there, and there's, some very good ones. There's some that aren't so good. But essentially the difference is for the retailer, or the guy that's doing the blending, our products are going to have a lot. We do a lot of things that have to do with proper, separation, proper pastille size, height to diameter ratios, the particle hardness, screening, the fines out. We also have, a dust collection system and a dust suppressant that we put on just before it's loaded. So for the dealer that's going to blend this stuff, it makes it easier for him. For the grower, we've had all the agronomic thing, everything that we can add that increases the degradability. That's what we do. Now, the growers quite often are buying it already applied, or it's already blended with something else. So, the dust component probably is not a big issue for them. We do some direct to farm through some of the bigger operations like co-ops and that don't do the blending. It'll go direct to farm, but it does go through the dealer.
Yeah.
And so in some cases, I think in most cases those are probably being it's not being blended. It's actually just broadcast, which is actually another good thing. Yeah.
For sure. And I'm going to turn back to Elston right now. And Kelsey, you're going to get ready for some questions, because I'm on my phone and I can't see the questions. So you'll queue up some for us in a little while here as we get towards the last 15 minutes. Elston, I'm going to give you a bit of a soapbox here. There's been a lot of resistance to elemental sulfur in the marketplace, especially in North America, especially maybe in Western Canada. And, as you and I have traveled around the world, there's so many opportunities to utilize this technology. And yet there continues to be this pervasive resistance. Any comments about that, buddy?
Oh my, how much time do we have?
Lobbying the ball to you, my friend.
Well, I think at the end of the day, there's lots of financial reasons and all that sort of stuff. But at the end of the day, there's a basic misunderstanding about how powerful nutrimental elemental sulfur can be in the farm management system. And let's face it, people have staked out their marketplaces, and when some of these new products that are now 30 and 40 years old enter the marketplace, with new concepts of, you know, applying large amounts to supply 3 to 5 years worth of sulfur, blah, 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 it sends a shock wave. And there's a lot of people that just resist. And of course, you know, back in the day, whenever we did research with elemental sulfur as scientists, there's a static thing that you get taught as a researcher, and that is, if I put on 10 pounds of sulfate sulfur, I must put on 10 pounds of elemental, even though they're completely different products.
Yeah.
And they behave completely differently. And it's like feeding a horse that you have on your farm the same ration as the dairy cow that you have on that farm. And it's like gets down to some really fundamental stuff like that. And so at the end of the day, once people simplify it and start thinking about it from a plant's perspective and a soil's perspective, and realizing that, you know, there's a very specific ratio that's required in crops to begin the whole process, and that's the N to S ratio, followed by the N to K ratio, followed by the calcium to boron ratio. Life just gets simpler. It gets way easier to understand, and all that acrimony and you know, you've heard me say, learn, unlearn, and relearn. Then we have an opportunity to unlearn and then relearn and move the whole process forward. And never mind the logistics that we already talked about, where, you know, just getting sulfur out of the tank or reducing the amount of sulfur in the tank increases the number of acres you can seed per tank, and all of the additional benefits of that. It just becomes a cascading synergy.
You know, when you're considering elemental sulfur like a Keg River 85 or a 90, and you're considering and you're comparing that to ammonium sulfate, you're really talking apples and oranges. They're not comparative products. They have to be treated different. Terry, I'm going to turn back to you and ask you a little question. Elston earlier on said that the nitrogen to sulfur ratios, in particular tissue testing, was very important. We advocate for soil testing, but when it comes to sulfur, it's a bit of an anomaly when it comes to soil testing, kind of wonky that way. Can you comment on, you know, the usefulness of soil testing as a tool for sulfur, why it may not be everything that we think of when we are thinking of potassium and phosphate and zinc, etc.?
How, Rob, how do you spell wonky? Because that's a good scientific term, wonky. I would say that the soil test for sulfur is marginal. It may give you some general ideas, but it's out of all the soil testing for elements, and I think AGVIS, I think other people dealing with, you know, with analysis, Stukenholz, Western, and many others. I don't want to start getting into them, but it's weak. It's just a weak soil analysis, and so tissue analysis. And again, looking at the ratio between the nitrogen and the sulfur, providing you, you know, somewhere depending on the crop, you know, a 12 to 1, 13 to 1 differences between the parts of nitrogen to the amount of sulfur, sulfate within the tissue, becomes the driving factor for making like in-season applications of sulfur, or other nutrients. Does that, you know, there could be some additional discussions, but
the general thrust, and go back to Elston to echo this, is that, you know, sulfur exists in so many states in the soil: calcium sulfate, magnesium sulfate, sodium sulfate, that, you know, 1 or 2 probes and you can get a high test. So we used to always say, if sulfur is high, ask why. If sulfur is low, then go. Elston, your comments on that, because it kind of summarizes it in a real simple way.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with your high why and low go, but I've also switched that since, you know, we started playing around with variable rate agriculture in the middle 90s, when that whole technology was in diapers, cloth diapers and stick pins. And, you know, we were sampling fields on a 1 acre grid basis, and the variability of sulfate sulfur across fields in dryland agriculture in Western Canada is like astronomical. And so once I learned that, I just said, no, I'm not paying any attention to soil test sulfur anymore, except in weird circumstances, 10 or 15% of them. Absolutely. And just went straight with ratios, because at the end of the day, the plant, a given species of plant, and I don't know what the number is for onions and stuff like that, but a given species of plant has a desired range of so much sulfur per so many pounds of nitrogen, and it's just that simple. So that got me thinking about, well, let's start thinking like plants instead of soil scientists who love to confuse the shit out of everybody. And then at the end of the day, it's just like, okay, this yield goal that you have this year requires 200 pounds of nitrogen. It's canola divided by 6. That's the amount of sulfur that the crop requires. And the other fun part about that is you cannot overdo sulfur. Your wall will get way more toxic before the soil gets toxic. And so, and then, you know, many years later, you start digging into the rabbit hole of sulfur nutrition, and you find all of the benefits of elevated levels of sulfur in tissue samples.
Well, Elston, comment a little bit about the essential proteins and how sulfur plays a role in cysteine, cysteine, methionine, et cetera, and why that's important even for livestock producers.
Well, so in there's about 20 amino acids, basic amino acids that form proteins. And of those 20, there's 2 that are sulfur-based, cysteine and methionine. And to grossly oversimplify everything, those 2 amino acids actually control the production of all of the rest of them. So at the end of the day, if you're short on sulfur, you're short on methionine and cysteine. If you're short on methionine and cysteine, you're short on the ability of the system to efficiently produce all of the amino acids, which turns into a bit of a sulfur shit show really quickly, and that just reduces your ability to hit the yield goals and surpass the yield goals. And that's what one of the main reasons why the N/S ratio is so important. But the other piece of that thing is that we've learned, you know, through the literature and everything else, is that when sulfur is high in plants,
15 minutes.
The plant creates a bunch of molecules, phytoalexins, glutathione. In fact, when a plant is full of sulfate sulfur, it converts some of that back to elemental sulfur, which acts like a plant antibiotic. And so it's just synergistic. It just keeps rippling and rippling and rippling through the system. And we know when the N/S ratio is correct, then the amount of nitrogen it requires to grow a crop, bushel of anything, goes down. And then once we nail the N/K ratio, it goes down even further, and blah, 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 blah.
Less wonkiness, and Bob's your uncle. Yeah, there you go.
Less wonkiness. And I think wonky came from Australia too. Yeah.
Yeah. Hey, Kelsey, do we have any questions that you could pose to us?
So we don't have any questions in the like Q&A box. So if you have any questions, please put them in. We're happy to answer them for you.
Perfect.
Apologies.
I'm gonna turn back
we have
over.
2 people doing this webinar at the office, but if you have any questions for all of us, please post them in the Q&A box down below. We're happy to answer them for you. We did get a text from someone that's actually watching the webinar from Brooke at AGvisorPRO. And the question is, when a farmer uses a nitrification inhibitor like DCD, or excuse my pronunciation of this one, nitropyrene, it puts the bacteria to sleep or kills them off. Are these the same bugs that are helping convert the elemental sulfur?
Oh, great. I'll turn that over to Terry. So we've got NBPT, we've got DCD, we've got all sorts of nitrification inhibitors. There's been a lot of speculation on the market that some of these will kill off some bacteria while they may stabilize nitrogen. Does that have an effect on the sulfur bacteria conversion?
Oh, Rob, there's a great question. Oh, thank you very much for loading that up to me. Well, I know that the nitrification inhibitors, whether it's DCD or ammonium or ATS or some of these others, they're directing for the nitrobacteria that are converting urea to urease and slowing that down. I don't think that those direct components are impacting, I may be completely wrong, but I think they're pretty directed at the nitrification types of bacteria, trying to, keep everything in the ammonium form and slowing the conversion down to nitrate. Rob, I don't think that
Yeah.
there's
Yeah,
that much of an
I
impact.
think
And
I
thank you very
think I
much
agree.
for the
Yeah, I think
tough
I agree.
question.
I mean, we got urea to ammonium, and so you want to have the urease enzyme in there, and then from ammonium into nitrate, you want to have reduce the nitrate reductase enzyme. Elston, your comment on it. I don't think this is a crossover issue.
No, this is splitting hairs, like, in my opinion, because at the end of the day, I agree with Terry. The nitrogen products are designed for that, and even if they did impede some of the elemental sulfur converting product organisms, there's hundreds of them in the soil, and so yeah, you might not knock out Bob, but Fred's ready to rumble. So yeah, we're splitting hairs.
Yeah. As we're winding this down, I want to make a couple comments just from my perspective and observing where the marketplace is going. We're going to have a lot more irrigation acres in Saskatchewan and Alberta. Those are going to tend to be on relatively higher pH ground. Elemental sulfur will play a role there. And I think that under irrigation, this has been fairly well entrenched. Terry, when you think about your marketplace, dry land versus irrigated, I think it's kind of been a pretty standard process in irrigated agriculture.
I think so. As I look at and things have developed for as long as Keg River's been in business. But I would say that generally for the higher value crops under irrigated conditions, elemental sulfur tends to be a regular application, and then in combination with others. So there's a component for the nutritive value, as well as the soil amendments, and trying to balance out those two would be something similar that you would see in Western Canada as irrigated ground, comes into effect as the soils warm up. I think that there would be opportunities for elemental sulfur, get the particle size down. As far as the soil amendment, you have a really difficult time changing the soil pH of if the soil pH, if the calcium carbonate equivalent is high, very, very high. There's field trials that show that you can lower the soil background to a certain level, but it tends to come right back up. But I really think, Rob, that some of the secrets as an agronomist is trying to pinpoint the application, trying to take measured steps and influencing the soils, soil health, soil nutrition, and looking at elemental sulfur as a practical application.
Yeah,
I think
I
it's
would
a
echo
balancing thing.
Yeah, I would echo that. And I've done work back in the day down in Alabama, and Texas, and even in those soils that are maybe lower pH soils, the role of elemental sulfur is interesting because ammonium sulfate will tend to flush, and it'll flush out acid fairly quickly, where elemental sulfur, even if you put it on at lower rates in those higher humidity, higher moisture scenarios, can provide for a more spoon-fed release of sulfurs. Now, we're going to wind this.
Rob, can I just jump in here?
Yeah.
Okay. Hey, I'm totally with you and Terry. And one thing, because of the expansion of acres in Western Canada, Saskatchewan and Alberta in particular, and because I'm involved with crop intelligence and the whole irrigation modeling that they're doing there, this is something that I know for absolute fact, is that most growers never analyze their water. Most growers don't actually clearly analyzed their soil. Most experts out there assume that there's a lot of sulfur coming out of the water, which is not necessarily true because it's highly dependent on the water source. And layered on top of that, some years we irrigate a lot and some years we don't because of the rainfall patterns and blah, blah, blah. So there's a huge opportunity on the elemental sulfur side for everything that Terry just mentioned and everything you just mentioned, to supplement that expanded acres with the proviso that, hey, Mr. Grower, let's get some water samples. Hey, Mr. Grower, let's make sure we know what's in the soil.
There you
And
go.
Kelsey, you said there's one question. We're gonna have one question, then I'm gonna close it off by letting Daryl wrap it up.
Awesome. Yeah. So one question that we have is from Andrew, and that's, we have had manifolded plugging issues, and then parentheses floater with treated urea blended with AMS. Is there the same issue with elemental sulfur blended with treated urea?
Perfect. This is a wonderful way to close off, because at the end of the day, what Daryl want to talk about is handling and quality. And so, Daryl, the question is, AMS, and Elston referred to this earlier. There are products out there that are soft. They get dusty. They don't handle very well. Talk to us a little bit about the handling characteristics of Keg River, and then maybe wind up the webinar by thanking everybody and sharing with us why you're so committed to moving forward with good agronomics.
You bet. Yeah, actually, the difference, when we first started to produce material, we needed to make a product that, could be safer. That was our main priority. And so that was part of the, why we were starting to make an 85%. And because we knew it to be safer, there was, test data that showed that. And, and so that was our initial thing. But we also, there's no good reason for us to, try any inferior, raw materials. And, one of the, things that we had faced initially is a lot of people think it's about cost, but, the raw materials that go into our product, it isn't about getting the cost down. It's about making sure that we can make a consistently good material. And we do testing all the time. We test every load that comes out. We sample that. When we can, we sample loads after they've already been received by the dealer. That may not make a lot of difference to the grower. Like he may not notice that, but so we like to know how much dust is generated in our handling, which, we have a lot of data on that. And when we can, we pull samples using probes, the proper way to do it after it's already been unloaded. So the same samples, so we know how it's been handled. We do that when we can of competing products. And what we often found is some people handle it too much, or they've stored it too long, and, and it becomes more brittle with time and will generate more dust. And so we also tend to, so we have a lot of production capacity, but we don't, say, for instance, if we go through the summer period, we're not going to store this product produce it all in May or June, and then ship it in September. What we would tend to do is we would do any of the package stuff that needs to go out, and we'll do that ahead of time. That has less impact on than shipping bulk. And the other thing is, we are open. So, we have our production plant. We've made many different products. We're always trying to look for ways to improve it. First of all, make it safer. And safe as we can. Always interested in keeping the degradability or improving on it, but also in adding other nutrients. And as we have made, micronutrients, we've used gypsum in the past, we've used humic acid, been successful at producing lots of different products. Not always, is it,
Not always does it commercialize at scale. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. So that's so we have on this site, we have a plant that produces roughly 360 metric tons a day, but we also have a smaller plant which is will produce less than that. We only plan to operate it for 12 hours of the day, but it'll be for producing these other products that are have to might have, we'll certainly, if we find interest, all of those other things for improving soil health, we would like to make our products safer at the same time. Yeah.
Well, I'm going to wrap this up, and
Yeah.
on behalf of the experts, I want to thank Dr. Terry Tindall.
Thank
And
you.
Terry and I go, way back, and it's great to have him here. And Elston and I go even further back to caveman era. And then Daryl, I want to thank you guys for hosting the webinar. I think it was good from a standpoint of just people understanding the agronomic side. Keg River, great supplier, 25 years in business, looking for more business. And thanks a lot for everybody who attended the webinar.
Well, thank you so much. And I agree. It's my first experience at doing that, and it's been a lot of fun. So I hope to do it again soon.
Thanks, Elston. Thanks, Terry.
Yeah.
You bet.
Yep.
Thanks,
Cheers.
everybody.
Thanks, Kelsey. Good
Happy
job.
Thursday. Happy Thursday.
You
See you,
too.
Elston.
See you guys.
Over and out.
Yep.
Over and out.